Okay, so I will now very quickly introduce our speakers and then hand over to Ankur, who will give the first talk. So our first speaker is Dr. Ankur Barua, who is the Senior Lecturer in Hindu Studies at the University of Cambridge. His primary research interests are Vedantic Hindu philosophical theology and Indo-Islamic styles of sociality. He also studies the theological and the socio-political aspects of Hindu-Christian engagements. In recent years, his research has focused on Indo-Islamic theology, and in particular, on an exploration of the intersections as well as the negotiations between bhakti, yoga, tawheed, and tasawwuf on the post-colonial landscapes of South Asia. And he will be speaking to us today about the particular interreligious friendships cultivated by Charles Freer Andrews in the crucible of 20th century British India. So before we go to Ankur, I'll just quickly introduce our second speaker, who is Dr. Mutharaj Swami. Dr. Swami is the director of the Cambridge Centre for Christianity Worldwide. He also teaches at the Faculty of Divinity at Cambridge and at the Cambridge Theological Federation. And since 2017, he has been a visiting fellow at St. John's College, Durham University. He is currently the project manager for theological education for mission in the Anglican Communion. And Dr. Swami's research interests include world Christianities, Indian Christian theologies, subaltern movements, local and grassroots ecumenism, and peace building and conflict transformation. And he'll be speaking to us today about the implications and the importance of interfaith friendships as they are lived and nurtured in everyday settings. So over to you, Ankur, for our first talk. Thank you. Thank you.
So can you see me? Sorry, or can you see the slide?
Yeah, all good.
And you can see me as well? Was that fine?
Yeah, that was fine. Yeah.
Okay, so let me do it again. Oh. So good afternoon to all of you, and maybe good morning and good evening. The central question that I'm going to explore today is this: is friendship possible in a context of asymmetrical power? And while I will be addressing this question specifically with respect to British India, 1858 to 1947, this exercise can be repeated with respect to other gradients of power on other socio-historical landscapes. Now, some of you may have read the novel A Passage to India, written by E.M. Forster, who studied at King's College, Cambridge. And if you have read that novel, you will know that the novel ends with a variation on my question: can the Englishman and the Indian be friends? Now, in recent years, I have been working on somewhat unusual or uncommon friendships that developed between certain British and Indian individuals against the backdrop of empire. So on the left-hand side of this slide, we have Leonard Elmhurst, who studied at Trinity College, Cambridge. And on the right-hand side, we have Charles Freer Andrews, who studied at Pembroke College, Cambridge. Now, one link which connects Elmhurst and Andrews is the figure of Rabindranath Tagore, who receives the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913. Now, Elmhurst sets up in 1922 an institute for rural reconstruction near Shantiniketan in West Bengal, where Tagore also sets up an international university, Vishwabharati, which is still there. Andrews, who was at some point vice principal of Westcott House, Cambridge, started living in Shantiniketan as a member of teaching staff from 1914. Before going to Shantiniketan, he taught for a while at St. Stephen's College, Delhi, where he supported the appointment of his friend, the first Indian Christian principal, Sushil Kumar Rudra. Now, in the light of these images, here is a question: what was the shape of Tagore's religious worldview that led him to cultivate such interreligious friendships? Now, one leitmotif in Tagore's writings is the difficult discipline of the quest for harmony in a world ridden with conflict And this harmony is to be realized through the forging of solidarity with fellow human beings, through communion with the natural world, and through artistic creativity. Now, without seeking to reconstruct Tagore's theological system in 15 minutes, let me just say that Tagore's reflections on the human self and the divine reality are rooted in forms of Vedanta, roughly from the 8th century CE onwards. And these are commentarial writings, partly on the ancient text called the Upanishads, roughly 600 BCE. Now, one common theme of Vedantic theology is that the human self truly recognizes its inner greatness when it is able to become properly recentered in the divine reality, namely Brahman. So Brahman is the divine reality infusing and structuring all humanity. Now, this Vedantic notion that one's friend or one's neighbor, in principle, the whole world, is one's another self, is reflected in a poem that Tagore dictated on his 80th birthday. Once when I went to the land of China, those whom I had not met put the mark of friendship on my forehead, calling me their own. A Chinese name I took, dressed in Chinese clothes. This I know in my mind, wherever I find my friend, there I am born anew. Thus, in an address in 1908, we find Tagore saying that whatever prevents our complete concordance with even one human being also restricts our union with Brahman. Therefore, if we regard our neighbors as other to us, we treat Brahman too as our other. In contrast, Tagore goes on to say that the great sages of ancient India have taught us that we must die to the ego every day, completely, and that is how we would live in friendship with Brahman. So given this deep interrelationality between self and other, we find Tagore writing in 1907 that the nature of the human heart is such that it is satisfied only when it is able to reproduce its own emotions in the emotions of others. Therefore, 2 years later, we find Tagore declaring that India, what he calls a Bharata, would play a crucial role in the ultimate fulfillment of humanity, where this fulfillment lies in realizing through union with the Supreme Self, our union with everything. Therefore, what we may call Tagore's Vedantic cosmopolitanism is one which does not efface, but indeed preserves the particular. So Tagore argues that just as by stringing together roses, jasmines, and lotuses, we do not achieve a higher beauty called interfloral, likewise, true universalism is not the breaking down of the walls of one's house, one's own house, but the offering of hospitality to one's guests and neighbors. And in words which are often quoted these days in contemporary literature on South Asia, Tagore writes that modernism does not lie in European dress styles or educational institutions where children are interned during lessons or square houses where people are caged. For true modernism is freedom of mind, not slavery of taste. It is independence of thought and action, not tutelage under European schoolmasters. It is science, but not its wrong application in life. Now, so much for what we may call Tagore's high theology. At the same time, Tagore often noted with deep pain that a true union between East and West had not yet taken place, partly because of the imperialist arrogance of the West, and partly because the East remains steeped in its own insular attitudes. So he notes in a speech in 1908 that if Indians see in the Englishman only a soldier, a merchant, or a bureaucrat, and are unable to interact with them in a manner where, quote unquote, man may communicate with man, Indians and the English will remain simply objects of mutual repugnance. Now, while Tagore severely denounced the forms of violence associated with Western styles of nationalism, it is crucial to highlight the point that Tagore distinguished between the spirit of the West and the nationalism of the West. So Tagore sought to critique the West without, however, essentializing the West. And this is a central point to keep in mind when we try to understand his friendship with C.F. Andrews. Here is a more general point. I'm sometimes asked to comment on the somewhat curious fact that some of the prominent figures associated with Indian anti-colonial movements cultivated personal friendships with individual Englishmen. And we will see this today in the case of Gandhi and Tagore, but we perhaps see this even more so in the case of Jawaharlal Nehru and Muhammad Ali Jinnah. And I think the answer to that question is, with some contextual variations, just this, that they were able to somehow forge a dynamic pathway on which they learned to critique the West without essentializing the West, while at the same time without romanticizing the East. Just therefore, at a time when it was common to present the West as essentially materialistic, Tagore argued, in fact, that the West possesses a deep spiritual core from which it has often departed. We observe in Europe, he says, the purest stream of human love of justice, of the spirit of self-sacrifice for higher ideals. The Christian culture of centuries in Europe has sunk deep in her life's core. In contrast, it is India, he claims in 1914, which has too much of spirituality of a world-negating type. Our life today needs more color, more expansion, more nourishment for the variety of its famished functions. Whatever may be the case in other countries, we need in India more fullness of life and not asceticism. Thus, he writes often in this particular decade of the 1910s and the 1920s as well, that the Hindu society has lost its inner dynamism, and the dharma of life, which should properly unfold through questioning, rejection, and progression, has been abandoned. As a result, Hindus have become mentally enfeebled, and because they are not willing to participate in the great drama of life, they have moved away from the responsibility of moving ahead vigorously. So in short, Tagore was opposed to monolithic antinomies such as quote-unquote West versus quote-unquote East. While he criticized Western nationalisms for producing mechanized cultures based on instrumental rationality, he also castigated the people of India for developing an inward-looking attitude that was not responsive to creative impulses from the West. So for Tagore, human freedom is to be attained not through tools drawn from Western nationalisms or chauvinistic forms of Indian assertion, but through the cultivation of a unity of humankind through love, harmony, and interdependence. Now, in the light of this discussion so far, one of the foundations of Tagore's convictions that the West possesses a deep spiritual foundation which was not visible to people who only saw its nationalist encasements was in fact his friendship with Andrews. And Tagore spoke about Andrews in an address delivered on his 80th birthday in these terms. I count such Englishmen as Andrews not only as my personal and intimate friends, but as friends of the whole human race. To have known them has been to me a treasured privilege. They have made me believe that English prestige will be saved from every shipwreck if there were more of such Englishmen. Had I not met them, not even the faintest hope would mitigate my despair with regard to the Western nations. So in effect, what Tagore is saying, that in Andrews, he has discerned the spiritual face of Europe. Perhaps the face has become defaced, but it is not yet effaced. And sometime in 1921, he writes that the dualism of East and West will be fulfilled in a deep unity, a deep harmony. And Andrews embodies this truth of unity through his own life. So in you, that is in you, Andrews, the apparent conflict of the East and the West has unveiled the great beauty of its inner reconciliation. So Tagore viewed Andrews as a true follower of Christ, who was engaged in the vast reconciliatory task of presenting Indian cases before the British government, sometimes in Shimla, sometimes in London, and who had thus produced in Indians, as he wrote in a letter in 1937, a respect for Christianity, which the most brutal lathi charges, shootings and detentions without trial of the British government in India have failed totally to dissipate. And here are two more extracts, the first from 1929, July the 9th, and the second from 1921, July the 21st. I cannot tell you how thankful I feel to you, you who have made it easier for me to love your people, your English people. For your own relationship with India has not been based upon a sense of duty, but upon genuine love. It makes me feel sad when I see this lesson of your love being lost, when it fails to inspire our people with the realization that love of humanity is with you far truer than patriotism. And before I finish this last letter to you, my friend, let me thank you with all my heart for your unfailing generosity in sending me letters through my absence from India. They have been to me like a constant supply of food and water to a caravan traveling through a desert. So Andrews emerges as a concrete embodiment of Tagore's own patterns of Vedantic religious cosmopolitanism, a solitary Christian individual who cultivates, in the teeth of opposition from some of his own countrymen, a distinctive individuality where he is engaged in these acts of reconciling love across socio-political asymmetries and divides. Now, Andrews, who moved to India as an Anglican missionary from Cambridge in 1904, gradually came to believe that the simplicity that Christ calls humankind to adopt in the Sermon on the Mount was being enacted not by his fellow English Christians, but by his three friends in India, a Muslim Maulvi in Old Delhi called Zaka Ullah, and two Hindus, Gandhi and Tagore. Thus he wrote, "It became clear to me that I must take up a firm stand, even against my own fellow countrymen and fellow Christian, since as a Christian it was necessary to bear witness for Christ's sake." And he often noted that Gandhi and Tagore had helped him, that is Andrews, to go back to the Christ of the Gospels. And he would write that he would take up the cross of Christ so that anything that stood between his Englishness and complete oneness with Indians would be removed. And in this way, Andrews believed that he would be truly acting in the spirit of Christ by serving India in the manner of a Hindu monastic, a sannyasi, that is to say, by giving up all worldly securities and trusting in nothing else but Christ. Now, Andrews' friendship was richly reciprocated by Gandhi, who told a gathering in Lahore, which is in present-day Pakistan, in 1919, at a very highly volatile juncture of the Indian anti-colonial struggle. As long as there is even one Andrews among the British people, we must, for the sake of such a one, namely Andrews, bear no hatred to them, the British people. And at Andrews' death in 1940, he wrote, "When we met in South Africa in 1914, we simply met as brothers and remained as such to the very end." And it is very important to note in this context that Andrews was one of the very few of Gandhi's contemporaries who always addressed him directly with his first name, Mohan. Almost everyone else called him Gandhi or Gandhiji. Now, how did Andrews himself view Gandhi and Tagore? So in one place, Andrews writes, "Personally, I have never in my whole life met anyone so completely satisfying the needs of friendship and intellectual understanding and spiritual sympathy as Tagore. His very presence always acts as an inspiration. Side by side with the friendship of the poet, I have had the supreme happiness of a second personal friendship with Mahatma Gandhi. His marvelous spiritual genius has appealed to me in a very different way. For his character, in his own way, is as great and as creative as that of Tagore. It is, however, of a more ascetic order." That's a point we can maybe discuss later in the discussion. What is that distinction that Andrews sees between Gandhi and Tagore, which has been commented upon by many other people, as it so happens? Now, somewhat unusually for Anglican missionaries at this time, 1904, 1914, Andrews also cultivated some deep friendships with Muslim intellectuals, such as Zaka Ullah, whom I mentioned a while ago. And Zaka Ullah was one of these Muslim writers who spent several decades preparing textbooks in science in Urdu. And he was also opposed to quote unquote Muhammadan isolation from Hindu environments. Andrews wrote that Zaka Ullah, who demonstrated a complete freedom of anxiety for the future and a deep love for children, reminded him of the Sermon on the Mount's reference to the peacemakers. And perhaps even more so, because Zaka Ullah himself believed that the Sermon on the Mount was an Indian text through and through. And Andrews was present at Zaka Ullah's bedside when he died, that is when Zaka Ullah died. And as Zaka Ullah slowly slipped into the silence of death, his last words were prayers to Allah and words of affection directed at Andrews. Beta, beta, that is my son, my son. Now the numerous interreligious friendships that structured, shaped, and sustained Andrews' life continue to caution us a century later not to confuse difference with otherness. Often we allow ourselves to be satisfied with a passive respect based on mere indifference towards others. And thus we do not work towards a more dynamic respect generated through active engagements with them. So for instance, while we may know how to tick the right boxes under how not to offend Hindus or what not to say to Muslims, we often lapse into viewing other religious traditions in the manner of distant spectators inspecting exotic curiosities. Andrews remained committed to his beloved Christ to the very end, but his was a theology in action that was forged in the crucibles of the heat and dust of Hindustan that went beyond some of our present-day passive modes of engagement with Hindus and Muslims and others. Now for Christians, what might be a scriptural foundation for cultivating more interactive, more informed, and more humane encounters with the neighbor? Andrews would probably have answered the sermon's call to a radical discipleship, the call that he was enabled to properly hear by his Hindu friends Gandhi and Tagore and Zaka Ullah during his long journeys across the terrains of South Asia. And this is also because, as Vedantic theological universes constantly remind us, the longest road is always the way back home. So as I end this discussion, let me return to the question with which I had started. Is friendship possible within a context of asymmetrical power? For better or for worse, I am an academic, and true to my academic colors, I have not directly answered this question with a yes or no. I have instead pointed to some of the complications that develop in the spaces of friendship across the milieus and the borderlines of asymmetrical power. Now, as it so happens, individuals such as Andrews are rarely studied in academic circles today. It is almost as if scholars do not know where to place him or where to situate him. So instead of answering my own question, I give you a theme which can become the topic of your MPhil dissertation or your PhD dissertation. Here are some individuals who forged pathways somewhat similar to Andrews. That is to say, they inhabited certain liminal spaces within which they attempted the difficult task of navigating interreligious or cross-cultural friendships. So to begin with, here is Annie Besant, and she was of Irish ancestry, and she was the first woman president of the Indian National Congress. So think about that. The first woman president was not an Indian, but was someone of Irish ancestry. Then Margaret Elizabeth Noble, Sister Nivedita, a disciple of Swami Vivekananda. Then Magdalene Slade Mirabai, later a disciple of Gandhi. Samuel Evans Stokes, the only American on that list. And Verrier Elwin, who was an Oxford man, he goes to India as an Anglican missionary, becomes a a disciple of Gandhi and works with the Adivasi people. So you can take up the question, is friendship possible in a context of asymmetrical power, and grapple with it in your MPhil or PhD dissertation with reference to one or more of these figures. If you seriously do pursue this line, I promise you a bibliography running into several pages. So that homework is already done for you. All you have to do is to read, feel, and think. Now, if technology allows me, I'm going to play 3 minutes of a slide from a movie. So let's see whether, so this is basically 2 minutes from the movie Gandhi, and you will see Andrews in action. Well, I mean, not the real man, but the person playing him. Let's see. Can I just check, can you see this?
Yeah, we can.
Okay.
मैं कहती हूँ ये तो बेवकूफी है पर हवा कितनी प्यारी है और अंदर तो जगह भी नहीं है बात सुनो अब दोनों भीतर आओ
Oh no, so I think the one I have does not have English subtitles. Okay, so I won't play this, but I'll tell you where to look. So go to the movie Gandhi, it's on YouTube, and look at roughly from 49:45 to 52:32. So those 3 minutes from 49 to 52, you will see Gandhi and Andrews in action in that movie, 1982 by Richard Attenborough. But that is where I will stop. I think I have come up to 2:30. Is that fine?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you for that amazing tour through Andrews, Gandhi, and Tagore, these amazing interconnections, and I'm sure it will prompt a lot of discussion. But before I go on to Musaraj. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Hinam and Joseph, for this invitation. And good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everyone. And thank you, Ankur, for your wonderful presentation about the cross-cultural friendships. That's really amazing, as Hina said. For my presentation this afternoon, I would be looking at interfaith dialogue or interreligious dialogue from a kind of a grassroots perspective, and how in everyday ordinary context interfaith or interreligious friendships are formed. And for this, I'll begin with kind of saying a bit about my background as well as my research background, how I got into interreligious, working on interreligious dialogue, and then I will move on to talk about how ordinary and everyday relations and friendships, interfaith friendships, can play a huge role in fostering interfaith harmony. First, I come from South India, and I come from interfaith family, if we can call a multi-religious family of Hindus and Christians. I'm a Christian, and some of my brothers are Hindus. So from my small age, I lived in this kind of family, and also in a similar setting. So my neighborhood is actually Hindus, Christians, and Muslims. And this was actually my background. When I got into my theological education, I was quite interested in how within the Christian circle, how Christians respond to other religions, and particularly I was coming across a number of fundamentalist attitudes, Christian fundamentalist attitudes towards other religions or other religious people. So this was the context I kind of developed an interest to study and work in interfaith dialogue more, in order to understand interfaith conflicts as well as the relationships. So I got into, after my initial theological education, I got into an interfaith organization in Tamil Nadu, in the southern part of Tamil Nadu, and I started working with them with that idea that, you know, interfaith dialogue is a better model. So anyone who is promoting interfaith dialogue, or who is involved in an interfaith dialogue, is really, you know, doing a great work, you know, bringing people together, bringing hostile communities together, and fostering peace and reconciliation in society. So, and obviously a noble task, and you know, with that approach I was involved, and I was learning, you know, from the field. But in that you know, course of time, what I came to learn was, it's not simply, I mean, interfaith dialogue is being promoted on the basis of, you know, philosophical dialogue, spiritual dialogue, and people learning about you know, each other's religions, and trying to overcome their misunderstanding about other religions. Because one of the common assumptions, you know, for among those who promote interfaith dialogue is that, you know, so most of the time people get into trouble, or people get into conflict because of, you know, because there is not enough understanding of other religions. So this was the, you know, so against this kind of, you know, approach, in order to overcome misunderstanding, then interfaith dialogue is a better way to, you know, overcome that. So, but when I was involved in the work, you know, gradually, when I went to villages, when I was kind of talking to people at the grassroots, that became actually a kind of a self-critical journey for me. And I started to realize that, you know, on the one hand, kind of, you know, we try to say that, you know, things are not proper, not, you know, not proper, so we need to promote dialogue. But on the other hand, you know, how people already live in interfaith relations, that often researchers and theologians and religious leaders fail to notice. So it is in this context then I started to kind of, you know, do an ethnographic you know, field work, and I got into my PhD work. Then I thought I would do actually an ethnographic field work, highlighting how grassroots communities, how they kind of negotiate and how they overcome conflicts through their everyday relations and everyday friendships. That sometimes it might be difficult to spot on. As I learned from my own work, you know, many of the things I took for granted, things that were, you know, the interfaith meetings, the interfaith friendships and relations that were kind of, you know, ordinary and the everyday, I realized how much I took for granted. And because I wanted to kind of push that, oh, there needs to be interfaith dialogue, so everybody should come together. So in that process, what I missed was actually how much, you know, I missed notice how much that was already taking place. So and at the end of my field work, then kind of talking to different communities, particularly in villages and, you know, rural communities in villages, as well as, you know, some towns. I was kind of, you know, trying to understand how these ordinary friendships matter a lot. So today I would kind of pick up in the light of some of the contemporary issues. I'll say how and why ordinary interfaith relationships matter, particularly in the context of you know, the urge to promote interfaith dialogue. So I must admit, my work in some way actually comes as a, you know, critic of the formal ongoing dialogue. So I have that, you know, in front of me. So the first area where you know, the ordinary and everyday interreligious relationships help is actually to what extent people at the grassroots, people in everyday life, including us, including, you know, the scholars and academics and religious leaders and theologians, in their everyday life, how we very often have we overcome strict religious labels or strict religious identities that that are on us, how we kind of challenge them. So one area, I mean, we live in a context where we kind of talk about religions as if they are a unified whole, like Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism. So we kind of, as if we can number them one by one. So this is partly due to some of the things that happened since the Enlightenment, where religion kind of came to be considered as a separate category, and compared to the secular or compared to politics or economics, a kind of secular religion or religious secular binary that was created, which also led to see religion as a separate unit, and then which led to see which kind of led in a way that these what we call world religions categories. So different world religions started to I mean the whole religious phenomenon started to be seen that way, as there is Hinduism, there is Islam, there is Christianity. So this world religions category also has kind of led to a strong religious identity for each one of us. I'm not trying to say that we don't have we don't have religiosity, or we don't have a religious worldview, but what has happened in the last 150 years is also, particularly speaking from an Indian point of view, a kind of an imposition of a religious identity. Okay, so you are this or you are that, so you are Hindu or you are Christian. So we have kind of come to accept that identity to some extent, though in reality we have a number of intra-religious identities and inter-religious identities. And this I was kind of noticing when I was doing my field work. As a researcher, I was using a number of times the word Hindu, Christian, Muslim. And then when I kind of when I was interacting with my interviewees, my audience in the grassroots communities, I realized, very rarely they were using these labels. So what they would be rather using is mostly intra-religious labels. For example, I come from South India, where CSI, Church of South India, as a denomination is quite popular, or there are Pentecostals, or there are Roman Catholic. So most of the time in my conversation with the people, they were referring to these identities, which I call intra-religious rather than Christian. Similarly, among Hindus, they were using, we have actually two cults in my region. So one is actually what's called, Ayyavali, that is the way of the father. There is a, worship of a male deity. And then this goddess tradition, where is called in my place Amman. So they just call the way of mother and way of father, and they would hardly use the word Hindu. And again, similarly, I could I could see among Muslims, again, the word Islam or Muslim was quite rare, and they would rather actually use the word Tulukans, that actually comes from Turks. So the more of a regional identity. So how actually people were in their everyday context, they were using very different labels, not accepting these kind of constructed world labels based on world religions, and I could see that was actually helping them a lot in relating with each other, and as well as negotiating. I'm not kind of trying to say that everything was fine among the grassroots. No, I mean, there are issues, there are conflicts, there are multiple factors involved, but they were actually able to relate with each other by challenging these fixed religious labels. So this is one area I see in the ordinary and everyday context. Interfaith relationships or friendships between people belonging to different religions are formed, where they actually challenge these world religions categories. Secondly, it is also we can see these everyday and ordinary relationships are, quite enduring compared to when I compare with, the formal interfaith, formal friendships that interfaith dialogue promote. Interfaith dialogue, in fact, promotes a number of, number they kind of, there are a number of programs and activities to bring together people to read each other's scripture and to kind of learn about each other's spirituality, and sometimes in some context to pray together. And so there are lots of things being done, and also a number of Christians who came to India and who were who admired the Indian, particularly the ashrams, and they became kind of deeply involved and attracted to the Indian spirituality, and would kind of argue that a proper dialogue between East and West would happen at the cave of heart, or at the spiritual level. So these kind of relationships and friendships are promoted in the formal interfaith dialogue. But what happens is, when people in the ordinary context, when they use multiple identities, so when they challenge religious labels, what they bring to the fore is actually the multiple identities that they have, and with that actually they challenge these the particular religious labels, and these identities really help a lot, and particularly again speaking from the context of India, which might be also applicable in other contexts where occupation or neighborhood or school, and even sometimes the positively or negatively the caste system and the blood relatives. So these all actually, there are different identities, multiple identities people have, and these influence what kind of friendships, what kind of interfaith friendships they form. As Ankur was talking about, he was giving the quote, where he talks about Andrew's meeting, something like, if I remember well, like we met as brothers. I mean, nothing else. So just like, this identity of, brotherhood, this I could see in one of the villages I went to do my field research. Irrespective of their religions, people would call, if they are elder brothers, they would just call Anna, which means, elder brother. It really doesn't matter. I mean, it is actually more of Anna or a brother is used more in a blood relationship context, but I could see people were quite broadly using these kind of these kind of labels or identifications in the ordinary context. So the multiple in the everyday and the ordinary context, people bring multiple identities, and that actually shapes what kind of relationship they form. It also helps many times, the particular conflict zones where when interreligious conflict, or at least conflicts that are named after particular religions, and people actually bring they defy those boundaries, and they bring different identities. And I also did a case study of a particular clash that took place in my district in 1982, which is kind of believed to be a religious clash. But then at the end, I could see that there were 16 identities involved when the actual Hindu-Christian conflict, when it took place. So there were multiple identities involved, multiple factors were involved in the conflict, but also equally when people who were defying that boundaries, who were kind of trying to overcome those conflicts, they were appealing to a number of other identities they share with each other. So this actually works very well in the everyday and ordinary context. This was actually the second factor I observed. And the third one is, I will close with this. The third one is the contemporary context in which I say I'm talking about the Indian context and also several other contexts where what we see majoritarianism based on a particular religious identity, like Hindu majoritarianism in India, or maybe some sort of Christian majoritarianism in America, as we are kind of observing what is happening in the politics there, particularly the conservative evangelicals and their role, or maybe Buddhist majoritarianism in Sri Lanka or Myanmar, or the Islamic majoritarianism in many of the countries where Islam is the dominant religion. So in all these contexts, we see that the interfaith phase looks like shrinking, and I'm kind of really getting concerned about the Indian context where we have actually interfaith dialogue was proposed as really a better model for bringing together Hindus, Christians, Muslims, and other religious people to work together for nation building, work together for better societies. So this was always the agenda of any interfaith movement or interfaith forum or interfaith gathering. But that space now we see actually kind of is shrinking because of the challenges due to populist leaders, appealing to the majoritarian religious identity to exclude people from other religions and traditions. So in that context, what I see is that actually kind of a lot of hope, hope lies with these ordinary grassroots people who really build a relationship among themselves. So sometimes this might be invisible. Sometimes it might be difficult to fathom how these ordinary friendships happen between communities. Obviously, as Ankur described, we got actually powerful stories of individuals coming together and cross-culturally, but when we extend this to communities, maybe several times how these communities come together and the common space and the public space that they share together is maybe also kind of invisible and difficult to understand. And this I could actually see in my research, many of the things. For example, one thing in the course of my reflection and conversation with my supervisor, I came to realize that in my village, every day, women in our houses, irrespective of their religious identities, they used to go to buy fish, together. And it never caught my eye earlier, and until, because I took for granted this is just okay, ordinary, this is happening, this is every day. But then these were the women who would actually keep the communities together when there is actually a tension or a conflict that would come. So these kind of relationships that happen at the grassroots really shapes the friendships, and they can actually really become offer a solid platform to really challenge some of the populist systems that currently use a dominant religion to exclude other religions. And to conclude, my point is that this is actually an area, unfortunately, kind of undermined in the mainline interfaith dialogue discourse or on the activities. So my argument has been that these everyday relations, they should really kind of play a huge role in what the interfaith dialogue proponents want to do to bring peace and reconciliation and harmony in society, where we could learn a lot from what is going on in the everyday context and from the grassroots communities. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Musaraj, for that, for those really, really important insights, I think, into this sort of everyday fluidity of identities and their sort of intersection with region. and locality, and yeah, just sort of really important reminders to question the category of religion itself as this kind of homogenous, or different religions as homogenous, isolated units. So thank you both. We do have quite a few questions coming in. So I think the first one is from Richard. Richard, I don't know if you want to say it yourself or do you want me to read it out? You can.
Thank you. I think it's been more or less answered in the